Hello, this is a presentation for the Jungian group, primarily, although of course, as with these things previously that I've recorded, it might be of interest to other people who are not part of the Suffolk Jungian circle. But the theme for November's discussion group is Jung's theories and ideas centering on alchemy. Now, normally I just talk straight to camera, but this presentation PowerPoint I did a few years ago, at least a slightly shorter version of this I did a few years ago. And I thought, because it's quite a visual thing and there's lots of terms and so on, it might be useful, rather than me just sitting in front of a camera waffling, to utilize some of the PowerPoint so that we can talk about some of the key issues involved. Hopefully it will be useful to you. So we'll just have a quick overlook. I'll try and keep it short, as well, about the same length as the normal conversations we have to camera for the Jungian group. But to look at some of his ideas, I'm not going to try and cover everything he said because it would take forever, but to look at some of his key ideas where he's talking about how he's inspired by ideas from medieval alchemy and works them into his understanding of psychology. For the main presentation, I obviously introduce him as a character and cover his life, but everybody in the Suffolk Jungian circle already knows who he is and all of that. But the key point on this slide, just to flag up before we move on, is that a lot of the work he did around alchemy was done in conjunction with Marie-Louise von France, who was a translator, as well as being many other psychologists and many other things as well. She had considerable skills in translating some of the early texts that were in Latin or in Greek into German for him so he could understand them. And so what I'd also suggest is she wasn't simply translating, she was helping him edit and understand and discuss and debate ideas. So which of the ideas we look at are entirely Jung's, which of them are perhaps originally from von Franz, which are maybe a half and half, I don't know. I don't suppose many other people know either, because when they're presented in the book, they're just presented as his ideas rather than saying, oh, Marie-Louise said this, Marie-Louise said that. So she may well be a person to credit for some of his ideas and concepts that are presented. So in terms of what he understands about alchemy, it's worth noting that alchemy is found in many, many, many cultures. Cynic cultures, that if anyone's unfamiliar with the term, that's Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, Korean, etc., ancient cultures from that part of the world. A huge amount of it comes from the Arabic world, from the Vedic cultures of India and the surrounding countries. Chiefly, most of the texts he looked at were the European ones. So if somebody were to delve very heavily and specifically into Chinese alchemy or into Indian alchemy, some of the ideas obviously would be similar, but you'd be looking at different terminology, different language, and there would be some ideas that crop up in those understandings of alchemy that do not crop up in the European versions, and vice versa. So if you were trying to look for psychological insights and understanding using alchemy from those parts of the world, you might come to somewhat different conclusions from the one that Jung came to. It does kind of beg a question that if, as Jung did, you regard alchemy as more symbolic and metaphorical for psychological states than reference texts for early chemists experimenting with various chemicals, then it could well be that the way people think in China, the way people think in India, is in some respects at least different from the way they think in Europe, and therefore you're getting different ideas worked into those cultures. So whether you would, a lot of it I'm sure would be quite similar, because humans are humans the planet over. We all fall in love, we all sometimes hate people, we all sometimes are very happy or very sad or whatever. There are common human experiences across the whole globe and throughout history. But it's also worth noting that certain cultures have ideas that are quite specific and unique to those cultures or certain periods of history, and you don't tend to find people thinking in those particular ways in other parts of the world or in other periods of history. So, yeah, kind of a combination of the universality of humanity, but also that sometimes there are culturally very specific features. And so a study of Jung's work based on European alchemy might give you an awful lot of insight into European minds and European thinking, and to some extent into universal human minds and thinking. But there could also be bits that you'd gain from studying the Chinese versions, the Indian versions, and so on, that would be of relevance to people from those cultures. Anyway, moving on. The chief focus of alchemy as it presents itself, in other words, not Jung's interpretation of it, but as the authors of the various different texts presented alchemy as being, one of the chief goals is using the Greek term chrysopoeia, which is the ambition to turn lead into gold. Now, when you see alchemists in TV shows and films and what have you, often that is taken very, very literally. There's some guy with a lump of lead putting it through various chemical processes in the hope, obviously it doesn't happen, but in the hope that lump of lead will turn into gold, and the alchemist will be super duper rich, and his patron, whoever's sponsoring him to do all of this chemical research, will also end up super duper rich. Obviously, nobody has yet, in the world of chemistry, come up with some amazing method to turn a lump of lead into a lump of gold. And Jung's understanding, which is also shared by various other people, is that to see this as a chemical process is to take too literal an understanding of what's going on. So that whilst there may have been people fiddling with chemicals trying to turn lead to gold, there were also other people who took the notion that the lead was not the actual metal, but a metaphor for a state of human consciousness, and equally the gold was not the actual metal, but another metaphor for another state of human consciousness. And so the chrysopoeia, the transformation, is taking a human being in state A, and eventually they end up in state Z. They transform into something completely different, having gone through a whole series of processes, stages, psychological developments, and evolution. And that, from a modern Jungian perspective, is largely what alchemy is about. It's not about chemistry. The chemistry is simply a metaphor for human transformations. Obviously, a psychobiologist would point out that the human brain does operate by chemistry, but it's neurochemicals rather than the kinds of chemicals that a medieval alchemist might have been tipping into jars and retorts and vials and what have you. But put that aside. There's also a big focus on the Philosopher's Stone, which apparently when Harry Potter books were released for the American market, they changed the title to the Sorcerer's Stone on the basis that they thought a lot of American kids and parents wouldn't go out and buy a book with the word philosopher in the title because it would look too highbrow. I don't know if that's true or not, and that's just a cynical marketing ploy. But whether you want to call it a Philosopher's Stone or a Sorcerer's Stone or something else, the stone itself is again a sort of a thing that people sought for, but so far as we know, nobody ever actually created as a physical thing. But the popular perception was that the physical stone, once you'd invented it, created it, would have the power both to help with the turning of lead to gold, but also to create an elixir of immortality. Now, what's not wholly clear from some of the medieval texts, and you get slightly different interpretations, is whether this is immortality of the Hollywood film variety, where you stay young and fit and glorious forever and ever and ever, so you could be 1,000,000 years old and still look like you're 20, or, as with one of the Greek myths, which I have recorded somewhere, I'll find a link if anyone's remotely interested, of well, it's not the hero who asks for it, it's sought for on his behalf by the nymph that he loves. She falls in love with a human, and she sees him getting old, and she, obviously nymphs live an awful lot longer than humans. This sort of demi-goddess nymph, and so she asks Zeus to make him live forever. And Zeus kind of leaves a rather long pregnant pause and says, "Are you sure?" And she says, "Absolutely, I want my boy to live forever." And Zeus does his magic, and he does the lad does live forever, but he ages forever. So he ends up 1,000,000 years old, looking 1,000,000 years old, which is obviously not a desirable state to be in when you're so wizened and decrepit and all your internal organs are packing up and what have you, that life becomes sheer hell and agony. So does the Philosopher's Stone give you not only immortality, but eternal youth? Or does it give you immortality, but with a shriveling, decaying, collapsing body that just never bloody well dies, even if sometimes you wish it would, I imagine, after a few thousand years worth of staggering around the planet with your body getting weaker and weaker and weaker on you. Again, Jung took the idea that whilst there might be some medieval alchemists genuinely thinking they could come up with a potion or a magic stone that would make them live for 10,000 years, that rather what was really going on was, again, a metaphor, a symbol, and that the Philosopher's Stone would grant not immortality of the body, living forever, but would give you such a sense of vitality, and you'd enter into a state of mind where you were completely in the zone, completely vital, completely engaged, completely in the moment. And so every day would feel like 1,000 years, and you'd, not in a bad way, but in a good way, in the sense that you'd enjoy life, you'd live it to the full. You would be absolutely engaged instead of, like most of us, worn down and frazzled out and sick to friggin' death of one thing after another after another. You would be in this tremendously vital moment. So you'd still get old, you still die at some point, but your life would be lived to the absolute fullest. And so the metaphor of the Philosopher's Stone is the granting of, shall we say, intense quality of life, which is a mental state, rather than physical endurance, which is a separate thing again. Okay, so moving on to the nuts and bolts of alchemy. The medieval texts use a variety of terms which Jung, shall we say, repurposes, gives new or additional meanings to, at any rate. And the texts, the European ones at any rate, some of them use Latin, some of them use Greek, so I'm including both the Latin and the Greek terminology at the top of this grid. They describe 4 stages through which materials have to be put, and again, the texts are not referring to psychological states, they're talking about processes as if it's chemists in a laboratory, and first you pour a bit of this stuff into that jar, and then you add in this, and then you heat it up, and then they're describing chemical processes, but Jung is saying these are metaphors. So the 4 stages are the nigredo, the albedo, the citrinitas, and the rubedo, the blackening, the whitening, the yellowing, and the reddening. So where we begin is on the left-hand side of the screen. So to start with, the raw human state is like lead. And obviously lead is a very dark colour. The actual metal, I mean. So the nigredo refers to the darkness, the inertia, the lumpiness of lead. Whether you take that literally as a reference to the metal, or whether, like Jung, you take it symbolically as a reference to a leaden state of mind. The unawakened, spiritually comatose, inert human being who is just lumbering through the day, going to work, paying their taxes, perhaps stuck in a boring humdrum relationship, boring humdrum family, boring humdrum friendships. Everything's a bit dull and dreary and unfulfilling, and they're in this leaden state. Then they have to go through a process, and the process is the nigredo process, the blackening process. Now, he links this to the 4 elements that the Greek philosopher Empedocles talked about: earth, air, fire, and water. So we're in the realm of earth to start with. And it's not enough just to sit there. In order to get moving, if you want to become spiritually enlightened, and he doesn't mean that in quite the sort of Buddhist sense of, sitting under the Bodhi tree and going om until you achieve enlightenment, but it's not dissimilar to that, in that it is a movement towards a more integrated mind. Because his argument is that when you're at the nigredo end of the market, your mind is disintegrated is perhaps not quite the right word to use, because that implies you're just a heap of ashes and particles, but your mind is fractured. It's broken into bits, and those bits rub up against each other in a very unpleasant way. And you'll be aware of some bits, but unaware of other bits. You'll feel their presence, but you won't be consciously aware of what they are or what's going on. So we get into the habit of doing things like projecting our emotions onto other people and seeing problems within us, but only seeing them in other people, because we're not integrated enough to see them in ourselves and understand what they are. And the goal of the human being from a Jungian point of view is to get to the rubedo end, the red end, where your various broken bits and fractured bits are healed, and they come together and they work in harmony with each other, like all of the organs in a very healthy body working in harmony with each other, whereas in an unhealthy body you've got organs failing and packing up and doing things they shouldn't be doing, and it brings down the whole system. It makes the whole body ill, even if a particular problem starts in one certain organ, but the kind of domino effect, the ripple effect, spreads to the whole body, and the whole body becomes diseased and dysfunctional. So what you have to do to get your backside in action, get yourself moving, first of all, step number one on the journey through the Negredo is to turn within and look at your own inner darkness. Now, Jung, like Joseph Campbell, like Jordan Peterson, like a ton of other people, was very keen on mythology, legend, storytelling. Again, arguing that they're not just stories to put the kids to sleep at night. They are, most of them, possibly not every single one of them, but most of them are metaphors for the human experience and the human journey. And so in a lot of stories, you get the goody, the hero, or the heroine, as the case may be, who is faced by a villain, a baddie, a dark force. And that dark force is the shadow. Now, Jung's take on it, which was shared by Hillman and Campbell and all these other people, is that ultimately by the time you get to the red end, you come to understand that the hero and the villain are the same person. There are two sides of the same coin. That all of the characters in the story are different aspects of one person rather than lots of different people. But at the Negredo end, it still feels that the individual identifies themselves with the hero. They don't realize yet that the villain, the darkness, the monster, the baddie, is also part of them. They see it as an externalized force. So they're looking at the people around them, and some of them, or usually one in particular, and there's kind of the arch villain, as it were, but there might be minor characters too. Some of them will seem very negative. They'll have qualities, traits that are awful and annoying and irritating and unpleasant and nasty. Jung's argument is that the reason why they are quite so annoying is because they're reflective of the individual's own qualities, own shortcomings, own problems. Which isn't to say that you couldn't meet someone and think, oh, you're not very nice. That doesn't automatically mean that you have the same problems they have. Because simply going, ooh, you're not very nice, isn't the kind of reaction that Jung's talking about. Jung's describing the kind of intense hatred and antipathy that burns on for years in feuds and what have you. And the reason it burns on for years is because that intense emotional resentment of the other person is born out of a deep-seated unconscious awareness that they're not simply not very nice, that their nasty qualities are reflected by what's in the individual themselves. In other words, to borrow a quote from Shakespeare's Taliban, Taliban, that's a bit of a Freudian slip there, isn't it? From the Tempest, the character of Caliban, the ugly, lumpy, monstrous character. At one point in the play, he looks in the mirror and he goes into a rage because he cannot bear to see his own ugliness, and he smashes the mirror. And in effect, what Jung is describing are situations where we meet someone whose unpleasantness is so similar to our own unpleasantness that it's like looking in a mirror. And we rage and we scream and we want to smash them in the face. And sometimes, of course, people actually do quite overtly go and smash them in the face, or shoot them, stab them, kill them, whatever they're going to do to them, because they're too similar. And the more intense the reaction, the more Jung sits there going, This isn't just someone who's a little bit annoying. This is someone who's very much like you, isn't it? And that's the real problem. So the term in Greek is kakodemon. A kako is where we get the word kak, shit, from, the shit demon, the nasty demon, the smelly demon. So if someone's a bit kaky, they're a bit shitty in that sense. They have the quality of the kakodemon, the seemingly terrible, destructive, awful force. And I say seemingly because part of Jung's argument in the process is that eventually you come to realize that the qualities you thought were terrible and awful and dreadful have redeeming features about them. And you see the benefits, not just the downsides. There are downsides. Jung's not saying it's all misunderstanding. Everything is a two-edged sword. Everything comes with both a benefit and a cost. So you start being very aware of the cost, the pain, one sharp edge of the sword, but eventually you become aware of the benefit, the other side of the sword, when you can start to integrate it into yourself. But first you have to go down into the darkness. And there's lots of stories, myths, legends, and whatnot from around the world of characters, the leading character, who at some point has to go and face some terrible, scary thing, whether it's the knight going into the cave to face down the dragon, or it's Orpheus going into the underworld to face the gods of the underworld in the hope of getting back the soul of his dead wife. But he's got to face the darkness and the monsters first. Similar stories from all over the world of having to face the darkness, having to face the monster. And the element of Orpheus is that, or the key point of Orpheus, I suppose, is that he wants to bring his dead wife back. So he's not going into the underworld for a holiday, go, oh, look at this, oh, look at that. He's going there to retrieve something. Not just to have a bit of a, there are some stories where it's more like a punch-up. They're going into the underworld to have beat up the baddie, and that's the end of it. But in a lot of stories, like the knight going into the dragon's cave, there is the hope not just of killing the dragon, but of either rescuing the princess or finding the dragon's gold or whatever it may be. There's something else to bring back. It's not just kill the baddie, that's the end of it, thank you very much. There is a rescue taking place. And the term used in a lot of religious context is harrowing. A harrowing is where you go into the underworld, into the land of the dead, or in the Christian, Muslim, Jewish sense, into hell. You descend into hell with the aim of bringing something back. So it's not a visit for the sake of nosiness. It's not a visit for the sake of bumping off some big bad scary monster. It is a visit chiefly for the purpose of bringing something back. You might well have to battle a big scary monster in the process, but mainly you're going to bring something back. The Greek term is katabasis, to journey into the place of darkness to retrieve something. And what is retrieved, again, from Jung's point of view, is a metaphor for all of the good qualities, the benefits. It's the other side of the sword. It's the treasure is the if you like, the good side of the dragon, or the benefits of the thing that seems so terrifying when you realise it also has a positive side to it as well as a negative side to it. There's another term you see at the bottom of the screen there, hopefully, nekia, which is a fascinating term, and I wonder if it might be worth a video on that alone. Nekia is partly connected to the word nekros, death, where we get necromancy from, conjuring up the spirits of the dead and talking to them. Nekia, you don't journey into the land of the dead, rather you call the dead to you. So like a medium, a spiritualist medium, somebody like that, you stay in the land of the living and you summon the dead to come from their realm up to you to bring you information or knowledge or wisdom or whatever it is. And so it's not quite the same thing as a journey into the land of the dead. It's different. And that can be part of the nigredo, part of the darkening, part of the experience of the dark side. But I think that's possibly worth a discussion in and of itself sometime, maybe 2024, perhaps, one of the topics we could look at. King Arthur, there's one of the very early stories of King Arthur. He goes into the land of Anun, into the land of Well, it's never wholly clear quite what Anun is the land of. Is it the land of the dead? Is it the land of the fairy folk? Is it something else? But it's other. It's not the land of the ordinary everyday people. It's the land of something strange and a bit scary and a bit magical. And King Arthur leads a band of his troops into the land of Anun and eventually comes back with all sorts of treasures. So there's many stories like that. Face the darkness, go within, journey down. If you come back, and not everyone does, and I'm not simply talking about myths and legends and stories and films. Obviously, you made the point that films and TV shows and whatnot are almost like the modern day versions of ancient mythology. They are the stories of our modern cultures, which have that same magical, mythological quality about them. There's all sorts of books written about superhero films and things like that, kind of comparing it to ancient myth and the superheroes being these rather godlike beings with magic powers, being somewhat akin to the Olympians of ancient Greece or the Netjeru of ancient Egypt or whatever. But if you survive, and if we're putting this in real world terms rather than superhero stories and so forth, then a lot of people go into a very dark place through booze, through drug addiction, through weird freaky sex or whatever. They go into all sorts of very dark places, and not all of them come back. Some of them die. They overdose. They contract some horrendous disease from sharing dirty needles. They go into a dark place and they are never seen again alive. So this isn't just some kind of lying on the couch whinging about your mother type of therapy. This is the kind of experience anyone can go through, and sometimes it's deadly. Sometimes there is no coming back. But let's be a bit more upbeat. And for those who do manage to make it out of the darkness and come back with the treasure, who have effectively started to come to a better set of terms with the inner darkness, with the scary cacodemon, with the shadow side, and they've started to see the good qualities of those personality traits and a bit and points of view and what have you that they previously thought of as being terrible and dreadful and awful and I don't know what else. And if we want to get a little bit controversial, we could point to fairly recent political events in the Western world. You know, people having the screaming abdabs about Brexit or Donald Trump or whatever, where we're seeing whole countries rifting, where there's a massive bunch of people on this side of an argument and another massive bunch of people on that side of an argument. And let's not forget all the probably even bigger number of people who couldn't care less who are over there somewhere. But you've got two camps forming who absolutely hate the bloody sight of each other and think that the ideologies of the other side are dreadful and stupid and terrible and I don't know what else. They're the worst people to ever walk the earth. And it's not just two people having a rather dry conversation about economics and say, oh, I think your economic theory is slightly misguided, sir. Ugh. It's rather people screaming and shouting and lobbing things at each other. And Jung would say the intensity of it suggests this is no longer an intellectual discussion about boring old political policies. This is a visceral, hate-filled descent into darkness. In what people maybe are really raging and ranting about is not so much the people over there waving a different coloured flag, rather it's something within themselves that they're raging and roaring about, which they are projecting outwards onto the people waving the other coloured flag. Whether they'll ever come to any kind of terms, I don't know. But it's not wholly uncommon to find people, and certainly there's a bunch of people on YouTube going, oh, I used to believe X and now I believe the opposite of X. And they talk about their journey from being very passionate about this particular ideology to getting kind of a bit jaded with it and coming to embrace the ideology that they used to hate and think of as dreadful and terrible. And sometimes that is just, maybe they just grew up a bit, or maybe they had a few life experiences, and sometimes somebody fell in love with a person from waving the other flag and actually stopped screaming long enough to sit down and listen to their point of view and think, actually, you're not quite as mad as I thought you were. and they get a bit more kind of balanced in their points of view. So that it's not only a process internally that happens in the mind. Sometimes there is a sort of partial resolution in terms of how it affects our outside relationships. And I think that's true of most things, that if you have Jung would argue, if you have an intense split in yourself, it will affect your daily relationships with other people. And if that intense split eventually heals, then your relationships with the people you previously hated the bloody sight of will start to change. So to put it in alchemical, magical terms, as within, so without, as above, so below. What changes in one dimension changes in the other dimension. It echoes. So the people who've started to come to terms with their darkness, it's a start. It doesn't mean you have to be absolutely 100% to terms, but you've moved away from the screaming abnabs into a state where you're starting to see the positives of the thing that scared the shit out of you. You're starting to see the positives of the thing you hated and loathed and despised, and you're getting a bit more balanced. You then move into albedo, or if you want to be Greek, glucosis, the whitening. And obviously the medieval alchemists weren't bogged down with obsessions with skin colour and things like that the way we are these days. So this has absolutely nothing to do with racial politics and dynamics. It's just alchemical symbolism and terms, which the albedo Jung associates with a more watery quality. And you might think, water, shouldn't that be blue or something? But it's associated with the white phase here. And in the albedo phase, the focus shifts off ranting and raving about your dark side and comes on to thinking about your contrasexual side. So if you're a man, you think about your feminine side. If you're a woman, you think about your masculine side, your anima or your animus, which is essentially the same thing, but with a slightly different take. And on one of the other slides, we'll go over it, look at the kind of breakdown of anima and animus in a little bit more depth. But Jung's argument is that a very male psyche has a feminine side, a very female psyche has a masculine side. And when we're young, we tend to want somebody else in our life who reflects the bit of us that's not very well developed. Because in the very masculine psyche, the feminine side is not very well developed. In the very feminine psyche, the masculine side is not very well developed. So we often turn to somebody else, fall in love with them or have a friendship with them or whatever, and they symbolize, act out, or at least we hope they will, those qualities we are not very good at. And I say hope we will because sometimes you can, obviously there's no end of love romances and friendships where person A thought person B was like a certain thing, and then a few months, few years down the line, they realise person B is nothing like they thought they were, and it all goes pear-shaped. So sometimes you make a very accurate assessment of what the other person is like, and sometimes you get it wrong. But either way, the same situation is playing out, that you're looking externally for someone to fulfill you by representing your undeveloped qualities in your life. Ultimately, what you should be doing, Jung says, is, and it could take decades to do it, but ultimately you get to the point where you start to work on your own inner qualities, and the previously undeveloped contrasexual qualities start to develop. So it doesn't mean that all your romances and friendships fizzle up and die. What it does mean is that you're no longer using that other person as a crutch. You're not heavily dependent upon them, so you can start to relate to them in a freer, nicer way. You're not burdening them with all your hang-ups and neuroses and demands. And they likewise, of course, because this is a two-way street, they likewise are not burdening you with their hang-ups and neuroses and demands if they also are going through the same process of maturation as you are. And it's important from a relationship psychology angle to always keep in mind that this is a two-way street. It's not just person A dependent on person B. Person B is mutually dependent on person A. Codependency, to put it into modern addiction jargon. Now, at a mythological level, storytelling level, cinematic level, we move from battling the big baddie scary thing to stories centered around the rescuing of a loved one. The handsome prince has to go and rescue the beautiful princess, or occasionally vice versa. And there are stories around the world where it's a woman rescuing a man rather than a man rescuing a woman. There's not very many stories where it's a man rescuing a man or a woman rescuing a woman. But, well, not until we get to the world of modern day cinema at any rate. But there are some stories where it's a same-sex thing. So even though it is symbolized from Jung's point of view as a male-female polarity, for a gay person, lesbian, it could be that obviously that the individual you fall in love with is another man or another woman, but that doesn't mean they don't still represent undeveloped qualities in you. Just because they've got the same set of genitals you have doesn't mean they don't embody a contrary set of qualities that you haven't got quite very well developed in yourself. So just to put it in that context, Jung didn't write extensively about gay issues. If anyone is ever desperately bored, I can waffle you to death with theories and ideas around how Jungian notions can apply to gay relationships, but that's a topic for another occasion. So you've got, I say, these stories of rescues taking place. And what the rescue symbolizes for Jung, at any rate, is unity, a growing unity between the masculine part and the feminine part of the same individual, regardless of biological sexes. This is the two halves of an individual starting to achieve balance, rather than one being very strongly developed and the other being very weakly developed. So the rescued quality is the weak, undeveloped, chained up, locked up in a tower, hidden in a cave, stuffed in a box at the bottom of the ocean, whatever it may be in the story, whatever metaphor is being used. It's something that is suffocated and limited and restrained. And the rescue is the setting free of that force. So it is no longer limited and undeveloped. It is growing and flowing and so forth. Which a lot of the alchemical texts use the moon as a symbol for albedo. And obviously that's putting it in purely practical terms, because the moon has a tremendous influence over bodies of water. And always worth bearing in mind that, of course, human beings are basically walking puddles. We've got so much water in our bodies that arguably we too have an influence from gravitational forces exerted by the moon, just as it does over rivers and lakes and the ocean and everything else. Now, if you manage to rescue your inner feminine or your inner masculine, you're still not done. It's a bit like the Harry Potter books, there's yet another one to come with yet another problem. You then move into the citrinitas phase, or xanthosis, the yellowing. Now, there are some alchemical books that skip the yellow phase, and indeed some Jungians who don't tend to give an awful lot of attention to the yellow phase. They tend to go straight from albedo to rubedo. But I think it's worth... Rudebo, sorry. It's worth a pause and a thought as to what's going on here. So the yellowing phase is associated with air, and it's the movement from dealing with the darkness, from dealing with the inner flip side gender, to dealing with the wise sage. And in stories, it's often the usually younger, not always, but usually younger character, the slightly naive character, the foolish third son, which is a common metaphor, obviously, in a lot of European folk tales, the dozy character who meets the wise old character. Usually it's a human being, a wise old man or a wise old woman, but you do get a lot of stories where it's an animal, the talking wolf or the talking horse or something like that, which appears in the story and basically tells the dozy hero or dozy heroine what they should be doing. When they're faced with a problem and they've got no idea how to deal with it, it's the wise character who turns up, the fairy godmother or fairy godfather or whatever kind of gender combinations you've got going on there, who turns up and says, look, dear, this is what you need to do, and gets them out of their sticky situation. So the cacodemon is the dark monster, the shitty monster, and the agartha demon is the benevolent, kind, wisely old what's-it, which, if it's female, is often referred to in Jungian terms as the wise witch, and if it's male, is often referred to as the wise sage. In Wicca, obviously, the idea of the crone, the wise woman, the older woman. Now, again, the argument here is that the wisdom is always within the individual rather than external to them. So if, as is not uncommon in a lot of kind of more New Agey types movements these days, somebody they read a book and come across some amazing idea and they go, oh wow, that tells me everything I need to do. There'll be a lot of New Agey types that go, well, you always knew it all along, you just needed a prompt to remember it, and suggest that the book has not told them anything they didn't know previously. It's just kind of brought to the surface something that they did know, but it was very deeply buried. And likewise, a lot of more kind of New Age healing techniques and spiritual healing techniques will make the argument that it's not the therapist or the doctor or the faith healer who is actually curing the diseases, it's the patient. Obviously, if you're looking at something like Christian faith healing, it's God that's doing it, not the patient, not the individual laying on of hands. It's God. But for a lot of more New Ageians, movements and ideas, it is the patient themselves who is healing their own problems, and the therapist is just the conduit to help them get into the right state of mind where the healing can take place. So it's very much this idea that everything is inside you. Whether you believe that or not, you could be a Jungian without going the full hog on that one, I dare say. But that's the argument being presented. So for the foolish character in the stories, it is the dawning of wisdom. It's the point in time where they meet the wise Whatsit, and they start listening to them rather than just blithely going their way. Because in a lot of these kind of folk tales, you get often three brothers or three sisters. The first two completely ignore the wise Whatsit, and the youngest one is the one who sits and pauses and listens. And again, you could take that as a metaphor that frequently in life we have situations where we don't listen, we blunder about and do the stupid thing once, twice, however many times, and then eventually we stop faffing around, sit down, shut our yap, and listen. And that's when we become the so-called foolish person and the foolishness, you could say, is the point in time where you say to yourself, actually, I don't know. I need to find out. Rather than being all arrogant and saying, oh, I know everything, I can deal with everything, I know this, I know that, I know the other. It's the point in time where you face the fact that actually you don't know. And the minute you admit to your own lack of knowledge, to your own lack of skill in a certain area, your own lack of understanding, your own foolishness, that is also the minute when wisdom starts to dawn, because it opens the crack in your ego of arrogance, which allows knowledge to come in. And it feels perhaps that the knowledge is external. A Jungian would say that it's just kind of bubbling up from a more unconscious part of yourself, but it comes in. We'll skip the bit about Sophia, because that was for a different lecture, going over notions of the Holy Spirit and of the feminine force of God, the Shekinah, the Sophia. But we'll leave that, unless somebody wants to discuss it in the discussion group, perhaps, but we'll leave that for now. So you started to resolve these three splits within the psyche: the split between the light and the dark, the split between the male and the female, the split between the wise side and the foolish side, between the experience and naivety, innocence and knowledge, whatever you want to call it. You then move into the reddening, into the fiery side. And the reddening is the sort of the positive state. There is not a particular rift that needs healing at this stage, because it's the first three rifts are the primary rifts you're having to deal with. So the fourth stage is the sort of completion of the healing, if you like. Jung uses the term syzygy, the coming together of opposites, the transformation from a set of broken parts into a functioning whole. A bit like starting with a box of jigsaw pieces, and then finally you click the last bit of jigsaw into place and it's complete. And you see what the picture is. You see what it's meant to look like. In Greek terms, apotheosis is the idea of becoming a god, becoming like a god. And obviously you've got lots of stories in Greek myth and other myths from around the world of someone who once was a human being who does something amazing and wondrous and is translated into a heavenly state. They become a god, either a full-on god or a demigod or some kind of a special being anyway. They become something more than human, more than ordinary. And in this fiery state, because all of your rifts have been healed, you've become something more than you were, more than the sum of your parts. You've achieved a gestalt status. This would be the point from a medieval alchemical sense, when you'd have found the philosopher's stone, you'd have you'd drunk the elixir of life, you would be achieving this amazing status. Something magical would have happened. Jung is not claiming for a minute that you live forever and stay looking 30 for the rest of your life or anything astounding like that. Rather, he's saying that the quality of your life becomes such that it's full and vivid and rich and dynamic, and your problems are resolved, and you understand the world in this profound way, you understand yourself in this profound way, and you can walk with deliberation in the world, and you can make things happen in the world around you because you are present in a way that most other people are not, because they're too busy run off their feet to be present, to be able to make a truly significant positive difference to the world. So this is the point in time in which you could start walking on your own bathwater and achieving wondrous things in the world around you, because you've already achieved wondrous things inside you. So godlike you can take in a slightly poetic way. He's not necessarily saying everyone should bow down and worship you. Now, obviously, there are lots of dodgy kind of cults around the world where some fruitcake says, "I am the new living god" or the new living goddess or whatever, and all of these people turn up and give him their money and bow down and worship him and buy him 15 Rolls Royces and all the rest of it. That's not what Jung is arguing for, because ultimately everybody becomes godlike. So it's not as if one person is absolutely godlike and everybody else has to bow and scrape before them. Ultimately, it's more like, well, not so much, let's put it like this. The image used in alchemical texts is the sun, in balance to the image of the moon earlier. And the sun, obviously, we know is a star. Now, it may be the star closest to our planet, but it's one of a billion stars. And so if you put it in that context, each person becomes a sun, ultimately, if they follow the route. But we also have to bear in mind that there are constellations upon constellations of stars. And so it's not that one person is this supreme glorious being and everybody else has to kiss their feet. Everybody can become this supreme glorious being, at least in theory, at any rate. If they follow the recommended process, they can become something special, something wondrous, which is a state to be desired. One of the terms used in the alchemical text, which also crops up in Jung's writing, is the cauda pavonis, which means the peacock's tail. The idea that everything has come together and you have all of the colours on display at once, and it's wondrous and amazing. And you are a spectacle to behold. Now, this is where the PowerPoint originally done was for a pagan event, so I'm not sure how relevant or interesting this would be for our non-pagan members, but I'll just chuck it out there briefly for the pagan ones and then skip on. The elements, earth, air, fire and water, are frequently arranged in this kind of a pattern, circle design, and associated with the seasons of the year and various other things as well, times a day and so on. If we're thinking of Jung, well, not so much Jung as the original alchemist's process, you start with the nigredo, you move to the albedo, you move across to the citrinitas, and then down to the rubedo. Eventually, you're going in this zigzag pattern, and that zigzag pattern crops up as a work of symbolism. There's a sigil in a number of different cultures, two of which I've chucked on the slide there of interest. Well, I think they might be of interest anyway. The Sigil rune, down there in the bottom right-hand corner, is the rune associated, of course, with the sun, with that glorious fiery orb, the attainment, and when it's used in divination and magic and things like that, it symbolises success. It symbolises having a brilliant, fabulous life, and everything is wonderful and falling into place. It's power and force and dynamism and making stuff happen, which is appropriate, I think, for the symbolism we're looking at here. The one in the top left-hand corner, nobody knows what that's called. It's just there, or at least not what it was called originally. It appears in Scotland on Pictish standing stones, and it's often referred to as a lightning strike by modern-day people. Quite how the Picts themselves understood it is anyone's guess, but it's a mysterious zigzag symbol, which does look a little bit like a lightning bolt, which stretching the point of credulity somewhat to suggest there is some kind of linkage going on here. But it's interesting that certain symbols do crop up in many different cultures, often with not dissimilar meanings to them. So to recap a little bit, the descent into darkness with Negredo. Syria Bridge and Pereira, I think she's dead now. I have to double check that one. But she was a leading Jungian theorist and exponent. One of her significant contributions was to argue that Jung was very kind of male focused, not in a nastily exclusionary fashion, just that's the way he was, that's the period of history he grew up in. And he tends to write from a very male point of view. And she wanted to make the argument that female psychology is somewhat different from male psychology. And so a lot of her work was geared around applying Jungian notions to women and female psychology. One of the stories she talks about quite a bit is the female descent into darkness, which in Sumerian mythology is embodied by the goddess Inanna, descending into the underworld through 7 gates and having to strip off veils at each of the gates, which is where you get the dance of the 7 veils from. And once she gets into the underworld in order to rescue her beloved, she has to meet with her sister, Ereshkigal. And Ereshkigal is a very, very, very spiky character, full of rage and anger and bitterness and darkness. And so it's the goddess of love and civilization, if you like, meeting with the inner darkness, the inner feminine darkness in this case. And so there's a lot more to Pereira's analysis than I'm saying here. But you can see metaphors and understanding and symbolism behind the 7 gates and all sorts of imagery coming up there to understand how women might experience these things. And obviously that's perhaps best a conversation that the women attending the Jungian circle might want to have with each other or indeed share with the men in the group. So I'm not going to presume to go into what I think it is, because it should be what other people actually experience it as being, who talk about it from that way. There's a similar thing for men, the idea of having to face that beast within, having to face their own inner darkness, and you do have lots of stories like Beauty and the Beast, things like that, although that's more of an animus tale. But the notion of the imagery of the werewolf, for example, that someone who is a man by day and appears to be well-behaved and civilized, when the moon is full, can become this ravening beast. Not simply a metaphor, because obviously there are individuals in the world who appear quite nice and pleasant, and then you later discover they've got 15 bodies buried under the floorboards. People often do have this kind of dichotomy between what they're like in one context and what they're like in a different, more private context. And I'd argue that we are all male and female alike, but possibly, if you want to link it into testosterone, possibly this becomes a bit more of an overt issue for men than it does for women. We are all wild animals at heart. We have survived umpty 100,000 years, partly because we are capable of great compassion and kindness towards our children and our nearest and dearest. It's that community element that's helped us survive, but also because we have been willing to do whatever the hell it takes in order to survive and protect our loved ones, which might include hunting wild beasts and cute fluffy bunny rabbits and things and killing them and ripping them apart and eating them, and battling off rival human tribes who might steal our food, and being willing to kill people or maim them severely to protect your own. we have that feral capacity still within us, no matter how genteel and civilized we like to pretend we are. We have to acknowledge that if we are threatened, you're walking down the street late at night and someone jumps out of a dark alleyway at you, within us each is the capacity to pick up the nearest brick and smash them in the face with it. That if someone were to, do something dreadful, harm, injure your child or some other individual that you deeply loved, then the capacity for vengeance, not just to fight off the attack in the very moment it happened, but maybe afterwards to go out for vengeance and rip that person limb from limb and do horrible things to them, is there. And there's no point pretending that we don't have a capacity for rage, for envy, for jealousy, for vengeance, for all of these very kind of dark primal emotions. And so part of the Nigredo is facing whatever our own personal individual darkness is. What is it that we are capable of doing in those dark, disillusioned times when envy and all these other grim emotions are bubbling up, willing to spread chaos and harm and destruction in the world? When you accept your own dark side, then you can start moving forward instead of pretending to be meek and mild and gentle and civilized and, I would never do anything like that. Well, actually you would. That's what it boils down to. And part of understanding the dark side, I won't go over this all over again because we've already done the 4 functions, but just to recap very quickly the element that each of these 4 functions has its own dark side. And so my dark side and your dark side might be quite different from each other. It's not that we all have identical darknesses within. We have our own individually tailored darknesses within, and we can understand those darknesses as coming in 4 main categories. These are my terms rather than terminology that Jung used. So the dark side of the sensation function is grasping and mean and needy and very, very, very pragmatic, very earthy, very focused on money and material possessions and so on, but in a very tight-fisted manner. The bright side is generosity and charity and kindness and goodness, but the dark side is very much that kind of Ebenezer Scrooge, tighter than a duck's arse approach to life, and dismissing everything that's outside the immediate financial material realities of the world as irrelevant. Love is irrelevant, spirituality is irrelevant, anything that's not bang practical is irrelevant. The dark side of the intuitive side, the fiery side, is the glassy-eyed maniacal fanatic who is so eaten up with their political ideologies, their religious ideologies, whatever other type of ideology they might have, that anyone who disagrees with them must be burned away, hurled onto the bonfire and incinerated, that no disagreement can be tolerated. There is one passionate overriding truth and everything else must be made to comply to it, share it, or be silenced. So you have all sorts of real life fanatics, unfortunately, as we know all too well at the moment, who are so determined to achieve what they want to achieve in the world that they'll burn the world to ash in order to achieve it and make people comply. The dark side of the feeling function is the insane, overbearing mother, or indeed insane, overbearing father for that matter, because it's not really a gendered thing. But that urge to care and nurture, taken to an extreme, suffocates, devours, infantilizes everyone around them, keeps them dependent, keeps them weak. It's the kind of mentality that leads to Munchausen's by proxy, where you sort of look after somebody and make sure they stay ill forever by poisoning them. So you can keep going on having them dependent, having them weak, having them reliant on you, and present yourself to the world as this all-caring, all-loving, all-nurturing thing. But actually you're devouring your very children. You're consuming the people that are dependent upon you. And when they're burnt out, you just go and find another one and another one and another one. So it's an excess flood of emotion that drowns the individual. And the dark side, I'm sure poor old Spock won't appreciate being called a dark side, but never mind, of the thinking function is someone who is so rational, so logical, so lost in their own intellect that they become like an emotional iceberg, frigid and able to carry out all sorts of functions that anyone with an ounce of compassion would find deeply unpleasant and would turn their stomach. Beginning the process of using others for experimentation. I want to know how this works, and I'm going to use you to find out how it works. And if you suffer and die in the process, well, tough luck, at least I found out what I wanted to know. So when you're writhing in pain and begging and screaming for me to stop the experiment, I just look on you as a slightly annoying experimental subject, rather than look upon you as a living being with rights and needs and your own life. You become nothing but a subject for my intellectual exercise, whether that's in the kind of animal vivisection end of the market or all the way through to the sort of horrific things that have gone on in different countries around the world where human beings have been used for horrendous experiments by usually quite clever individuals, quite intellectually accomplished individuals who fail to view the humans before them as humans in the first place. They just see them as experimental subjects to exercise their knowledge on. The albedo bit, just to briefly revisit that, I say briefly, with the anima animus, Jung broke down the anima into 4 phases. And again, I won't go over this at any length because it can always become a subject for another discussion at some point next year, maybe. He breaks it down into Eve and Helen and Mary and Sophia, linking them into figures from Christian myth and Greek myth, like Helen of Troy, and so forth, as to these are 4 aspects of the feminine side of a man, rather than 4 aspects of actual women. And on the other side, which I have to admit I find slightly annoying because it lacks symmetry. My feeling is that if he went with Eve for the anima, he should have called the animus Adam. He should have found 4 male figures from myth and used those names. So it's what he's done on the one half, he's not done on the other half. I find that a bit annoying. But he talks about the man of muscle, the man of action, the man of words, the man of spirit. And again, these are 4 aspects of the masculine half of a woman's psyche. These are not 4 aspects of actual men. That must be understood. And so you might prefer to relate to one more than another. You might envision your masculine half or your feminine half as being more one of these than it is the other 3. But that's what you'll look for in relationships, and that's what you must eventually come to realize is an undeveloped trait within yourself, and then develop it, work on it, build it up. So just a slight pause for the alchemists themselves, because he does make an argument which is interesting, might be worth discussing, that the alchemist as a figure, an archetypal figure, is very linked to Christ-like figures, because obviously whereas Christ is in Christian tales is out trying to redeem humanity, the alchemist is redeeming metals and chemicals, taking lumps of lead and turning them into something better and higher and more wondrous. So it's again Jung's idea that this is not to be taken too literally. It's to be taken, alchemy, as a metaphor for the transformation of humanity, human by human, one by one. A word found in alchemical text, Mercurius, is also used by Jung himself. Mercurius is the sort of the completed, rounded person, the one who balances the male and the female, the light and the dark, the wise and the foolish, one in which these previously contradictory, fractured qualities have come together, have become one. So that's the sort of status that's being aimed towards. Well, obviously that's Dumbledore and Voldemort and the rest of it is all modern takes on this idea of the wise and the foolish, of encountering the inner light, but that inner light can sometimes manifest in a positive way and sometimes in a dark way. So sometimes the great wise wizard is Dumbledore, and sometimes the great powerful wizard is Voldemort. They're both possessed of immense knowledge, but one uses it for good and the other uses it for bad. So even within this notion of the wise force that's encountered within the Citrinus stage, sometimes it can be a very admirable force and it's seen in a very positive light, but sometimes it can be seen in a very scary light, a very dangerous light, as a dark force that might cause harm. But it's basically two sides of the same thing. So the wisdom that can heal the world is also the wisdom, knowledge, whatever you want to call it, that can destroy the world if it's misused, if it's applied wrongly. The doctor that could cure cancer is also potentially the doctor that could create a germ warfare bomb and release it. The knowledge is the same. It could go in a good direction, it could go in a bad direction, because ultimately the knowledge is morally neutral. It's what you do with it that determines whether it's a positive or a negative. And that's a factor that's worth bearing in mind. The rubedo phase, one term, sometimes he refers to it by the term of individuation, becoming your full true self, your sort of integrated being. Sometimes he uses the alchemical term mysterium conjunctionis, the coming together, the conjoining of opposites. It's all references to the same kind of a notion. He also uses this term deus absconditus, the disappeared God, the abandoned God, the God that's abandoned us rather than the other way around. The divine presence for the person who is oblivious to it, unaware of it, hiding away in the dark shadows, scared of everything around them. They won't see the divine spark in the world. And equally, perhaps possibly more importantly, they won't see the divine spark in themselves. They'll feel as if they have nothing inside them, no soul, no special qualities, no nothing. They're an irrelevancy. And part of this unfolding into the God self is not to become a screaming egomaniac who demands to be worshipped. Rather, it's to become someone who is aware that each and every one of us has this star-like quality, this essence of the universe within them, this divine spark, this magical presence. So the God that seems to have vanished and run off somewhere, you come to realise was with it like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. You had it all along by the time she gets to the end of the film. And it was always there. You just didn't notice it. You didn't look at it. You didn't see it. You were so busy looking for what you wanted everywhere else that you didn't look in the one place you should have looked, in the side. And part of that is not just some abstract notion of you sort of walking on your own bathwater and radiating a halo. Alfred Adler used the wonderfully bizarre German term Gemeinschaftsgefühle to describe the idea that a person in this sort of a state would be kind and loving and caring and balanced. They would relish life. They would be creative. They would be artistic. They would hug puppies and help old ladies across the road and behave in a very benevolent, good way. It wasn't just a change in mind. It was a change that rippled out to your behaviour, to your engagement in the world. You would be the kind of person that puppies wanted to come to because they'd sense your inner goodness. That you would have this kind of domino rippling of change in the whole of your life, and that change would then impact others. So a little bit maybe like the Buddhist idea of the bodhisattva, of someone you have attained a state of great wisdom and knowledge and and then you are able to help others. Your very presence has a beneficial impact on the people around you, and they sense the goodness within you. Might scare the living daylights out of some of them, of course, but others it will inspire and uplift, and they'll want to be part of it. One of the things I love about alchemy is all of the symbols. It kind of appeals to my inner schoolboy of wanting mysterious magical symbols and writing in codes. This is just a teeny tiny sample of the ridiculously large amount of symbols that get used in alchemical texts and manuscripts. Sadly, Jung didn't make an awful lot of use of these. He didn't go around kind of trying to attribute deep, meaningful symbols and saying, well, the phosphorus means this, and the sulfur means that, and the magnesium means something else. He just kind of parked that to one side. But that doesn't mean that might not be the case. So if we're going to argue that the nigredo and the albedo and all the rest of it have symbolic meanings and are not really actually about chemistry, then you could equally argue that where these ancient manuscripts are referring to antimony and lead and sulfur and zinc, that they are not so much referring to the actual metals and chemicals and whatnot. They're referring to metaphors for something else. For what, I do not know. I'm not going to attempt to suggest. Could be a future book in there, who knows. But something to mull over, something to consider. But that's me done. You'll be relieved to hear. So these ideas, hopefully, we can pick up on in the meeting when we have our online discussions, and we can go from there and discuss what these things might actually mean. It'd be interesting to hear your points of view on that one. So I'll just finish now. So take care. Bye-bye.